Reimagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. Except for very brief moments in its history, America has never been seriously interested in committing to addressing the issue of poverty and the plight of poor people. To the contrary, the emphasis has been on regulating and controlling the poor. Except for the Great Depression of the 1930s and the civil rights years of the 1960s, the poor were largely hidden and invisible, left to their own devices to struggle with the often brutal, dehumanizing forces of the marketplace. Since the poor had little influence and power on government policy or the woven racist narrative of the media, welfare and poverty came to be seen as essentially a Black problem, and racist images of Black women on welfare and their malingering men dominated the imagination of America, both white and Black. Reverend William Barber and our guest today on the Radical Imagination, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, have reached across the decades and resurrected a poor people's campaign to reimagine the poverty debate in their just published book, White Poverty: How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. They expose the false myths and images that obscures the poverty of tens of millions of white people. The simple truth is that the faces of America's poor are overwhelmingly white. They see poverty as an endemic feature of an economic system that deliberately divides poor whites and poor Blacks, preventing them from uniting against the policies and structures that favor the rich and powerful. With a new extended definition of poverty that would show that whites are vastly more likely to be poor than Blacks, a moral fusion movement of poor whites and Blacks recognizing their commonality could flourish and blossom. Only a relatively small number of the tens of millions of America's poorest earners voting for politicians who spoke to their interests would be necessary to win elections in swing districts and states. That in turn would reconstruct and save American democracy. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is a frequent co-author with Reverend William Barber and active in the Poor People's Campaign. He's a founder of the School for Conversion and assistant director of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at the Yale Divinity School. He's a dear friend and comrade and has been a frequent co-host on this show. Above all else, he brings a joy, a depth of feeling, love of life, and compassion that touches us all.
Wow, what an introduction, Brother Jim. Always good to be with you.
Brother Jonathan, it's all true. And this is the book. This is the book right here.
I brought my copy too. I didn't know if you wanted to turn to the text, but we're ready. Let's dive in.
Dive in, and we've got to send this to every household in America, and just everybody's got to read this. It's just magnificent, and let's dive in. Yes, the book starts with the need for a new definition, an expanded definition of poverty. Why is that important? How is that central to what you're trying to get across here in the book?
Well, I am so grateful for my brother, Reverend Barber, and his determination to redefine poverty. It really has been fundamental to his work to reestablish the Poor People's Campaign. The reason we have to begin by redefining poverty is because we don't see the crisis that exists in this country. And the primary reason we don't see it is we don't measure it. The federal poverty measure is based on a formula that was developed in the 1960s, and that said at that time that what it costs a household to eat is roughly 1/3 of what it costs a household to exist in the United States. And that may have been roughly true at that time, but the increase in the cost of healthcare, education, transportation, and housing over the last half a century has made that formula really ridiculous. I mean, if you make $14,000 in the United States today, you're not considered poor by the official poverty measure that the federal government uses. And that's also the measure that's used for most of our statistics on poverty. So we're not even counting the problem that exists. And because we don't see it, we are not addressing it. We, in this book, look at the alternatives that are available, the supplemental poverty measure, and another measure that the Federal Reserve uses to ask what would happen if any economic unit or household had a $500 emergency this month. If you ask that question and say who would be ruined by just a $500 emergency, which could happen to anybody who blows a set of tires in this country, then we have a full 41% of our country that's living in poverty. So we want to look at that. Why is it that in the United States of America we allow that level of poverty? It's the fourth leading cause of death in the United States because of its severity. It kills 800 people every day. When COVID was killing 800 people a day, we of course called it a pandemic. Poverty is killing that many people now. This is an epidemic. And if we begin to look at the problem, then I think we can talk about what the real solutions are. So that's why we begin by redefining poverty.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the statistics are 60 years old here.
Yeah.
This is really, really ridiculous. So when you do expand that definition, you're talking about 66 million whites and 26 million blacks who fall in that category, correct? So we're talking about, go ahead.
That's right. So you mentioned in your introduction that we are living in a context where poverty has been racialized, and in many ways that racialized image of poverty is used to blame poor people for their poverty, but it very much paints poverty as a Black issue. Now, we are absolutely clear in our analysis that racism is real and has had a direct impact on poor people. And it is still the case that Black and brown people in the United States are disproportionately impacted by poverty. Nevertheless, according to the numbers that you just cited, there are 40 million more poor white people than poor Black people in the country right now. And so the racialized narrative that that denigrates and blames Black people also dismisses tens of millions of poor white people. And we think that looking at that fact in terms of our current data helps to expose the myth of race for what it really is, which is a creation of the plantation owner class in the southern United States in the 17th century, a creation that was meant to divide the people who were not benefiting from the system. And while the system has changed and evolved over the years, it's certainly the case that race continues to be used to divide the very people that could unite in order to build a democracy that works for everyone. So that's why we're talking about white poverty, not in a way that dismisses race, but in a way that gets at what race really is and what it's been used to do in this country.
That's so profoundly important. And so many Americans, so many people in our audience, so many of my students, perhaps even yours, still in some way see race as some sort of biological construct. Yeah. It's a social construct. So if you can briefly get into this, you get into the book here, and it's just fascinating. 1619, right, in Virginia. Yeah. How does this definition begin to occur, as you say, in the plantation system? Why does it become necessary at this point to create these divisions? And again, based on economic.
That's right.
To control and exploit and so on. So just flesh that out a little bit for our audience, because I don't think this is one of the myths, again, one of the stories that Americans are clueless about.
Well, a good sociologist like yourself understands this and the impact that it's had. I mean, this is what the great W.B. Du Bois was trying to focus people on a century ago in terms of sociologically the role that race plays. But one of the things we do in the book is come at it historically, go back to the colony of Virginia and look at what actually happened when enslaved Africans were first brought to the colony, 1619. They're right there alongside indentured white folks from Europe who are in very much a similar situation. And as a matter of fact, if you go back and look at it, the way we understand race now didn't even exist, right? These were people whose lives belonged to the folks they were working for some period of time. As the colony evolved, there were particular cases in which the ruling folks in that colony decided in their legislature to define people according to race. One of the most well-known stories is of a fellow named John Punch, who ran away. He was under an indenture and ran away with two others. They were caught and brought to trial. And when the court decided what the consequence was for them escaping their indenture, the two people of European descent were given an extension on their indenture. But Mr. Punch, who was of African descent, was rendered by the court to be a perpetual servant of the person he was working for at that time. And in this way, race begins to become a category that defines people and their identity. Fast forward, we talk about Bacon's Rebellion, which was an attempt to overthrow the British government that existed in the colony. It was led by a man named Bacon, but he had both black and white supporters who joined his rebellion, and they actually did run the colonial authorities out of Jamestown. And when the British Royal Navy came and reestablished the colonial power there, then the Virginia legislature followed with clearer and clearer definitions of race in a way that was meant to make sure that poor white people and poor black people would not join forces again in order to challenge the established order there in the Virginia colony. So we cover this history in order to help people understand that, race came from a particular set of historical circumstances, and it was designed for a particular use. It was designed to prop up that plantation economy that was about exploiting land, of course, that had belonged, that had been the home of Native and indigenous people here, but also the bodies of people who had been brought here to work that land. And in that context, where a very few people were benefiting from the land and the labor of others, race was designed as a way of dividing the everyday people of the colony. It has continued to function in that way. And that's what the great sociologist Du Bois and others have tried to point us toward. And very much what our organizing and movement in the Poor People's Campaign today is trying to interrupt by bringing people together who've been pitted against one another in order to build what we call fusion coalitions that have the power to reconstruct democracy.
That's very, very helpful. And it really, again, puts it within a historical context. This is nothing new. This is 400 years of this sort of back and forth of rebellion, resistance, organizing, and counter organizing and punishment and so on, and force to make sure that the groups would not organize and so on. Now
we get caught up in that story, of course, when we try to respond to these sort of pseudo populist movements like we have in the world today, and certainly in the United States with the MAGA movement. I mean, these are movements that are essentially using the old wedge issue of race to appeal to people and communities and you hear it, in the language that Donald Trump uses now, that I mean, just in the most recent debate, he was talking about so-called black jobs and that Hispanics were going to come and take black jobs. This notion that poor people are in some kind of, struggle and contest for the limited resources, and that someone, a strong man figure like that could somehow be a champion for the poor white folks. That's an old lie that has been repeated in different ways, but it is exposed by the reality of the politics that such politicians practice, right? That I mean, here's someone who was president, and when in office, his signature achievement was cutting taxes for the richest people in the country, right? Essentially, today's plantation owner class is who benefited from the actual policies, and yet he goes out to the rallies and pretends to be a champion of the people. That's the kind of function that race has always played, and when people begin to see through it and realize the common interest that poor and working people have, we have an incredible capacity to build movements that have real majority power in a democracy.
Yeah, no, that's again very helpful. The real agenda is what you just described there. The elites, the rich, the super rich, maintain power, pits people against each other. And how about the role of religion here and the churches also, by and large, backing up that notion? And again, the ideology that if you fail, it's because of your own individual lack of trying. And we've never really tackled or wanted to tackle the larger structural issues that you mentioned. 800 people a day die from what sociologists call structural violence. That's close to 300,000 people a year, but we don't blink an eye on that. That's not, that doesn't become a crisis. The Homestead Act also, wasn't that a vehicle, a further divide? This was mainly benefiting whites who were given a chance to own land in the frontier, in a sense. I know Cornel West recently in his Gifford lectures was talking about the Turner thesis. The frontier thesis is sort of a safety valve, and this is a vehicle through which people, mainly whites, had an opportunity to move to different areas and to create a situation where they can be separate from what is perceived to be lesser human beings, if you will. And also creating this, as Cornell puts it, this sense of innocence that we have in the country, that is rooted in a certain negativity or image of ourselves as inferior to Europeans.
Yes, indeed.
It gets very, very complicated. And again, the scapegoating of various groups, primarily blacks, become the central point. And what you were pointing out, how do we get people to develop a consciousness and a commonality, which is, of course, what you're trying to do in the movement there and in the book?
Yeah, no, what Brother West is referring to there is, of course, the great insight of James Baldwin when he said the innocence constitutes the crime. And the innocence, of course, has been reinforced in the minds of people who think of themselves as white and Christian by a distorted theology. And we try to trace that and how it developed right out of the Virginia colony. At the gut level of human beings, there's always a reaction against this kind of exploitation. You can't treat other people like that, right? You can't enslave people without an act of war. You can't take people's land without an act of war. There's a gut level reaction against that. And so people have always had to say, well, here's our justification. And in the Virginia colony, the Virginia Assembly, got together and considered first the question of whether the baptism of enslaved people necessarily until they're free. After all, I'm a Christian preacher. If I baptize somebody into the body of Christ, then they're sisters and brothers with everybody else. Christian people have always understood that, the imagery of that. And in the Virginia colony, they were wrestling with how can you then enslave somebody that you've called your sister or brother in Christ? And so the Virginia Assembly rules that in no way does baptism affect someone's status within the plantation system and slavery as it was developing at that time. The plantation owners got together and made a theological declaration that, of course, reinforced the system that they were building and benefiting from. So that has been part of the American story. Sociologists today describe this as Christian nationalism. I hesitate to call it Christian as a Christian myself because it is so anathema to the way that Jesus taught and practiced. Nevertheless, it is using my faith, the language of my faith, to try to appeal to people. And so we see all of this stuff that's happening, the law down that was passed in Louisiana that says the 10 Commandments have to be on every classroom. We got the Secretary of Education out there in Oklahoma declaring that everybody has to teach the Bible in public schools. I mean, these are people who believe that their distorted vision of Christianity can be imposed on people in order to prop up this hierarchical vision of the world where they and their so-called values are on top and everybody else has to get in line. And it's a fundamental rejection, really, of what I understand to be the message of Jesus. And so, yes, to build coalitions that can resist this, I think we have to both challenge the lies of racism and challenge the distortions of faith. Because, as a Christian in America, I also want to point out that Christian faith and other faiths have played a huge role in movements that have expanded democracy and moved us toward a more perfect union. So you can't talk about the abolitionists of the 19th century. You can't talk about the civil rights movement of the 20th century, the women's rights movement, even the movement for equality with the LGBTQ community, without talking about the role that religion and religious leaders played in those movements for the expansion of justice. And so I don't think in any way we have to get faith out of public life, but we do have to address the distortions of faith where it's being deeply misused in order to prop up these lies and these myths that we're really trying to expose in the book.
That's a great point. And of course, there's a struggle also within the Jewish world over the prophetic tradition of radical love, and what's going on in the name of that. Well, it's not in the name of that tradition. It's contrary to that tradition. That you could cherry pick all kinds of things from the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures, and also the Christian Bible. So greed,
religious nationalism happens all over the world, using all kinds of religions. That is clear. But what you're pointing to is that folks within a religious tradition can always point to the heart of the tradition and the way that it actually points us toward a very different ethic and morality. And I think that is very much what's needed. To me, the influence of religious nationalism in the world right now is both terrifying because it has such disastrous consequences, but it is also a reminder of how powerful faith is for all people. We particularly in the 20th century, there was a lot of talk about a secular age and a sort of post-religious reality in the West. I think in some ways many of us neglected the essentially human role that our spirituality and religious traditions play for human communities. There's a lot of power in that. And so we can't give that power over to the extremists who are trying to leverage it for nationalism. We need faith-fueled movements that tap into that prophetic tradition you were talking about. It's a tradition that your faith and mine share, a prophetic tradition that points us toward love and mercy and justice, and gives us real concrete examples of how people of faith have pushed toward that in different societal structures over time.
Yeah, and then of course, so you're absolutely right. This is such a powerful, hopeful book too, that I think you're making that point. We, as Reverend Barber puts it, we can't turn back. We're on the road, and there are enormous possibilities to finally get this right, and we have that opportunity now. What I was taken by this wonderful example that Reverend Barber gives of his visit to a church is it the Mountain Church? Where is this now, in Virginia? So he went into the how would you call it, the lion's den there. In a sense, these are people who were not necessarily his fans, and yet tell us a little about that experience where these people, very hard bitten and so on, began to join with Reverend Barber in that moral fusion, beginning to develop that consciousness that we've been taken. And how do they put it? Don't poke the pig or something.
Don't poke the bear. That's right.
The bear, right? Because these people aren't stupid, but
that's
they,
right.
They also are realizing, hey, you know what? People have turned against us. People really don't care. But Reverend Barber began to turn it around. Give us a little understanding.
Well, these myths that we've been talking about, one of the ways they are manifest and perpetuating injustice today is this belief that we are hopelessly divided. This notion that we, live in a nation that's so polarized that, people can't get on the same page. And the moral fusion movement that Reverend Barber has been leading for years, that really has been his life's work, is about interrupting that. Of course, that's how we met one another. I come from a community up in Western North Carolina in Stokes County, that was heavily targeted by the religious nationalists of the 1980s and 90s, and where, certainly that county has not gone for a Democrat since Jimmy Carter ran for president. And so in some ways it would be considered a red county, but he was willing to come there and to talk to somebody like me when I was a teenager trying to find my way, because he understands that that in many ways that sort of red county, blue county, red state, blue state division that we have is a perpetuation of this myth, and that in so many ways that political reality that exists because of election results is an illusion, because it doesn't represent the people in those places. It only represents the folks who vote. There are so many people who have been turned off by the whole system that, even in the most so-called red county, there's great potential for people who could come together around an agenda that unites them to completely turn those kinds of images and results on their head. So the story you were mentioning was back in 2013 when we were in the midst of the Moral Monday movement here in North Carolina. Reverend Barber received an invitation from this church up in Western North Carolina that they wanted him to come and talk about the organizing that was happening down at the State House. Now, he was at the time the head of the NAACP for the state. And this is a part of Mitchell County, North Carolina, where in the 1920s, every Black person was run out of the county, as happened in many places during that time period. This is right around Red Summer and after World War I, when violence against African Americans really created a lot of the Great Migration and displacement that happened all around the country. But that had happened in Mitchell County. Mitchell County was, 99% white and probably 90% Republican. But these folks had heard about what was happening, and they understood that what was happening in the state legislature at the time was cutting public school funding and was going to directly impact all of the families up there. These are mostly farming families. I grew up in a community like that, and farming families in North Carolina, usually the wife has a teaching job so the family can have health insurance. And these cuts to public education were hurting those folks. They were directly cutting unemployment insurance at that time, and they were refusing to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. That was denying 500,000 people in North Carolina access to health care, and 350,000 of those people were white. So there were a lot of folks up in places like Mitchell County that would have had access to health care except for what the legislature was doing. So Reverend Barber went and he talked to them in that church. He talked to them about it from a moral perspective, from a biblical perspective as a pastor. And he talked about this moral fusion vision that we were trying to put into practice through the organizing we were doing at the State House. And lo and behold, here in Mitchell County, the white folks stood up and said they wanted to start a chapter of the NAACP. And
amazing.
And they said, we'll be an all white chapter, but you'll be our president. And so it's the kind of interruption that we've experienced over and over again. And so this book is full of stories about, interactions like that have happened in the hills of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and down in Mississippi. I mean, places where when we've talked to people about the issues that are directly impacting their lives, people are not as hopelessly divided as the political pundits would have us believe. As a matter of fact, people are desperate for a political vision that could improve their lives and that could unite them with other people in similar circumstances. And so that's why we really do believe that poor people of every race in this country have an incredible amount of power in this moment, because when united around an agenda, poor people are the swing vote that can decide elections in the United States right now.
Yeah, I want to get into those figures too. So what you're talking about also are hurt, traumatized people who are responding in oftentimes destructive or self-destructive ways, are feeding into that agenda, scapegoating people. So how do you break that cycle is what seems you're talking about. And that goes for all around the world. So many of the conflicts and wars and so on, which
we do have to break the cycle, but I think it's important to realize that, oftentimes this gets framed as poor white people voting against their own interests. And while certainly there are some, the people who, show up at Trump rallies are real, these aren't actors or something, but on the whole, that's actually not true. Poor people as a group did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020. If you take poor people as a group, the data we have is income data. So the lowest quintile is those who make less than $50,000 a year. Donald Trump lost that demographic by 14 points in 2020. So that is not his base. He could not have won in 2016 without winning the over 150,000 category of voters. And so in many ways, there's a myth going on here too, where poor people are getting blamed for the political actions of their wealthier neighbors. As a matter of fact, most poor folks don't show up. They're not coming out on the first Tuesday in November because they have, in their estimation, often better things to do and don't see someone directly speaking to their issues. And so we think that it's, and the reason we wrote this book is we really believe that if politicians want to tap into this base, they need to speak directly to people who are struggling to survive in this economy, speak directly to them about what policies they're willing to get behind in order to lift them. Things like living wages and access to health care, affordable, real investment in affordable housing and in paid family leave. And we know that things like this are doable. They don't break the bank. We often in Washington we hear that we just don't have money for these kind of things, even though when there's a request for more spending on war, there's always money. We're told over and over again there's just not enough money for these things. But as a matter of fact, many people experienced during the pandemic, for example, the expanded child tax credit and the reality of real money being deposited into their bank accounts every month, and saw the difference that can make in their lives and in their communities. This is the kind of thing that we believe can make a difference in terms of giving something people to vote for. And we wrote White Poverty because we really want to make that the conversation in this country in this critical election year. There's a lot of people who are concerned about saving democracy. I share their concern. But a more fundamental question of whether we can save democracy is, what kind of democracy is worth saving? And I think for the critical swing vote that we're talking about, the people who have to decide whether it's worth it for them to make the effort to show up or not, the question is, do we have political leadership that's willing to speak directly to them about the kind of policies that could make their lives better?
Well, that's the big question for both parties, right? Who don't necessarily do that. So break down a little bit for our audience the figures. A rather small percentage of the tens of millions would be, if they would vote, could really turn this whole thing around. Give us a little of the data that you have talked about here.
Yeah, well, when we were writing the book, we were working with data that a study at Columbia University had done to look at the last really 30 years of voting and the participation of low income voters over and against higher income voters. And on average, over those decades, low income voters participated at 20 to 22 percentage points lower than their higher income neighbors. So we're talking about tens of millions of votes here nationwide. And what we then looked at state by state is, in the critical states that are going to decide the election because of the Electoral College, what percentage of low income voters would have to turn out, what percentage increase would there have to be in order to to make up the margin? And in all of the so-called swing states, that increase in turnout would only have to be 15 to 20%. So we're talking about a relatively small lift in terms of the potential of this this sort of block as a whole. But the key question becomes, what is it that would motivate people to turn out? Now, we really believe in grassroots organizing and in the power of neighbors speaking to neighbors about these issues to turn people out. I think it makes a critical difference, and we go through a few stories in the book of the kind of organizing we've done in targeted ways since 2019 to try to put that into practice. But we also know that the power of grassroots movements is greatly amplified when people who are running for office, who have the huge ad dollars to spend on TV, decide to speak directly to the issues that these movements are raising. And so this is both a call for organizing that all of us can participate in, and a real challenge to people who are running for public office to speak directly to these issues and to say, if I have power in this government, whether it's in Congress or in the office of the president, what I'm going to do with that power is invest in this vision of economic policy that could benefit poor people.
So you've got be on the tightrope here. You're not going to, you know, go for any particular candidate, but what you talk about is the program that then hopefully some candidate will take to be their own, and it's a winning combination here. Now we haven't. I'm just tossing out a name, Robert Kennedy. I'm not talking about Junior here now, but that's in my lifetime. That would be the last person that I can remember carrying the ball on the sort of policies you're talking about. And of course, today I think it's Cornel West. So how do you get those leaders, whether it's Biden or whoever takes over, possibly? Or do we give up totally on Trump? How do you get them to take in what you've said in this book?
Well, you know, we live in a democracy, fragile as it is. We have to use the structures of the system within which we live. And so a piece of the Poor People's Campaign has been to put this challenge before people who are running for public office. We are sincerely nonpartisan on this. We're saying these are political issues that are more fundamental than any kind of, you know, party's vision for sort of the best way to run government. So what we're asking is for everyone to say as clearly as they can to this block of potential voters, here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what my party is willing to do. You know, we just had in Washington a moral march on Washington and a mass assembly of poor people and low-wage workers on June 29th. There were tens of thousands of people there who are committed to this campaign and who pledged to go back to their communities and reach out to their neighbors about these things. And we, from there, issued a challenge to you know the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of their party platforms, and certainly to people who are running for Congress and for president to say, you know, where they stand on these issues. I think that poor people aren't dumb, and they can discern, you know, which people are going to do the most for them if they can hear what their plans are. I really do believe in people. I think the key issue has been that most politicians, since the era that you were speaking of earlier, of when Bobby Kennedy was running for president, most candidates for public office in this country have simply not addressed poor people. They've tried to either blame poor people for their poverty or to speak about, you know, the middle class and you know, the need to sort of have a growing economy. But poor people understand that you know, it doesn't really matter if the economy is growing if
You're just talking about the stock market, for example.
Yeah, if the fundamental measures don't take into effect the quality of their lives. I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about how low unemployment is. I often remind people that unemployment was 0% under slavery, but that sure wasn't to the benefit of the people who were enslaved. Right. So poor people understand this and know that if the economy is really going to be good, it has to be good for them and for their everyday needs.
And that makes it good for everyone else.
Absolutely.
The great overwhelming majority. That's very important to say. And I love how you bring in the remnant of people who remember, going way back thousands of years, who are people who do carry the banner of what you're talking about here, that we should work together, that we are our brother's keeper, and so on. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I love the way Reverend Barber puts it. For a movement to succeed, it doesn't have to change the wind. It just has to gather a force that accelerates forward to create a vacuum that can pull the whole society forward. If we set our sails right, then moral fusion can pull us where we need to go, even against the headwinds of injustice. We don't have to deny the headwinds, they're there. We need not pretend that the dangers roaring about us are not real. It is. To hold on to hope that a third Reconstruction is yet possible, we simply have to allow ourselves to be caught up in the moral fusion movement that is accelerating toward love, justice, and mercy for all. We only have to press on forward together. The powerful movement will create a vacuum that pulls the ship of state forward toward a third Reconstruction. Oh my God.
Hey, we need that message now. Lord, we need so many people teetering on the edge of despair. That's what he calls his social Bernoulli principle. You know, the Bernoulli principle is this: how can you sail against the headwind?
There you go.
You got to get the wind to go faster around one side than it does the other. Creates that vacuum. That's what can happen when movements organize people. We got to infuse that kind of hope in the country right now. Oh my goodness! If you spend some time with poor people, you realize we cannot afford despair. Now, too many people are living too close to the edge. We can't afford despair. We've got to invest in hope, and in hope that can pull us forward in the way that he's talking about right there. That's why I stand with my brother. He is a man of faith and a man of hope.
I can see your whole being lit up there. So is mine. I mean, but listen.
And that's why I want people to read. That's why I want people to read this book. Please, I mean, it's fundamentally a hope-filled book. Absolutely. And a book about what can bring us together in a time when, you know, on the one hand, so many people are trying to divide us. On the other hand, so many people are so in despair about how divided we are. No, we need some hope right in the middle of it all. Some hope that says, no, there are ways we can come together. We can learn from the past. We can look forward to the future. We know how to come together.
See, now that's a perfect segue. I told you I wanted you to spend a little bit of time talking about Granny Byrne and Granny Taylor in your life.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Oh, look at that. Okay. Yeah. That moves you too.
Yes, indeed.
What hope did they give you as a kid?
You know, first of all, it's a gift to write this book with my brother. And then as we were writing it, he said, you know, you've got to write in your own voice at the end. You've got to write about your experience. So I did. And when I did, I was thinking about my grannies. So I told you a little bit earlier about where I grew up in the 1980s and 90s. And at that time, my great grandmothers were both living when I was a child. And what were one of the great joys of life for me and my brother, I have an older brother, 14 months older than me, was going over to Granny's. They both lived in the same apartment complex. So we could run back and forth between their apartments, and, you know, they would dote on us and hug and kiss us and make us good food. And, you know, I just have such fond memories of that. But as we were writing about what was happening to communities like mine during that time period, you know, I realized with the piece I wrote as the epilogue, I called How Black Power Saved My White Grannies, because I realized that it was Black people who had political power who, with, you know, their political allies, pushed policies in the 1970s that created the real goods that sustained my great grandmothers were both poor white women who had grown up in the mountains of Virginia, North Carolina, and at the end of their lives, they were living on Social Security. They were living in a HUD housing complex, and that wonderful macaroni and cheese that my granny made for me, she made it with what we call government cheese. So these were all government programs that were sustaining their lives and, you know, making it possible for them to love on little boys like us. Yeah. And at the same time that we were benefiting from that reality, the local political culture was telling us that government programs were stealing from taxpayers and that, you know, welfare was a bad thing. And so it was moving for me to get to write about my grannies and to remember them, and in some ways to realize how the song of this whole movement, this Poor People's Campaign, is a song that is about, you know, singing their hopes for me and my family, their hopes for the future of the community that they had lived their lives in. And it kind of, it's full circle for me. I told you earlier how, Reverend Barber was willing to come to my community, which, he had every reason not to come to a place like that. This was almost 30 years ago now when I was a teenager. But with the Poor People's Campaign, we went back to Stokes County, where I'm from. And it was actually in a little church there, listening to the stories of people who had been impacted by coal ash poisoning, that a power plant had left coal ash in ponds that had seeped into the well water. And people were sharing about the impacts that had had on them. And in that context, Yara Allen, who's a theomusicologist and song leader in our movement, she wrote the song that has really become the anthem for our movement. It says, "Somebody's been hurting my people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore." She just listening to the people in that service, that song came to her, and it really has become our anthem. So we sing it all over now. And whenever I sing it, I can hear my granny singing right there with everybody else. And it was a gift to get to write about them at the end of that book.
And it's absolutely, it's a profound gift of validation amidst the lies and attempts to distort. Yeah. And actually, I had a friend, I think Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, who worked with Pete Seeger, who also sang that song at the Poor People's Resurrection City. So that goes back. So we're all trying to maintain some sort of sanity as well as we move forward here against the headwinds of greed and really toxicity. So again, this is a book of great hope, and just as you are, as my granny too, gave me hope as you were talking about it, and you used the term doting, and that's what we need to do: dote on the love and the good food and the beauty of life. Yeah. And my God, that's what we need. And we need this book. We need people to read this book. We only have a few seconds to go. There's a lot more I wanted to get into, Johnson, but I think we covered most of it. And what's the next step here for the Poor People's Campaign as you move forward?
I hope people will take this book and use it as a sort of conversation starter in their communities, because it really is about sort of rooting ourselves in this vision. From now until November, the Poor People's Campaign in communities across this country is going to be reaching out to 15 million poor, low-income voters who we've already identified. We have their contact information. These are people who are already registered to vote, but often don't vote because they don't see anyone speaking to them. Members of our campaign, people who have sort of adopted this narrative and organizing strategy, are going to be reaching out directly to those 15 million people and letting them know that they have the power to decide this election. And so we hope people will join their state coordinating committees in that work all across the country.
Well, I will continue doing that. I know that maybe all will come out to the Hamptons, because there is a sizable number of poor people out there. We're doing some organizing there. There's a whole lot of people that need to hear the message and get out there and vote as well. We're over time, Jonathan. Thank you as always. It's a blessing and a pleasure. Love you so very much, and take care. Be well. And thank you all very, very much for listening to us this week. Please get this book, White Poverty: How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy, Reverend Dr. William J. Barber with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Thank you so very much. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.